The wind carried the smell of wood smoke and horse sweat through the streets of Millbrook that morning, and it carried something else too. The sound of two women laughing at a child who had done nothing wrong except be poor. Sarah Whitfield stood behind the counter of her late husband's dry goods store, though it wasn't hers anymore, not really. 3 months since the fever took Thomas, and every day since had been a slow bleeding out of everything they'd built together. She watched through the front window as her daughter Emma walked toward the store, and she watched the moment it happened. The exact moment two women in fine bonnets turned their heads and began to whisper behind gloved hands. Emma was 9 years old. She wore a dress made from a flour sack, bleached and dyed as best Sarah could manage with what little coin she had left, the seams mended twice over because the girl was growing and there was no money for new cloth. It was not a beautiful dress, but it was clean and it was made with love, and until that moment Emma had worn it without shame, because shame was something that had to be taught to a child, and someone was teaching it to her right there on the boardwalk. The younger of the two women, Prudence Callahan, said something Sarah couldn't hear from inside the store, but she saw Emma's shoulders curl inward like a leaf touched by frost. The older woman, Mrs. Callahan's mother-in-law by marriage, let out a laugh sharp enough to cut glass. Emma stopped walking. She looked down at her own dress, at the mended seam along her sleeve, and something in her small face crumpled in a way that made Sarah's chest ache like she'd been struck. What neither Sarah nor the two laughing women knew was that a third pair of eyes had witnessed the whole thing from across the street. Standing quiet in the shade of the feed store awning, a tall man in a plain gray coat with dust on his boots and nothing about him that announced who he was. His name was Jacob Reyes, and he owned more land in that county than any 3 men combined, cattle numbering in the thousands. A house on the hill that folks called a mansion, though he never once called it that himself. He didn't wear his wealth, he never had. He'd learned young that the loudest men in a room were rarely the ones worth listening to, and he built his whole life around that lesson. He watched Emma's small hand come up to cover the mended seam on her sleeve, as if she could hide it, as if hiding it would undo what had already been said. He watched her walk faster, head down toward the store where her mother stood frozen behind the counter, with her own hand pressed flat against her chest. And Jacob Reyes felt something settle in him, quiet and cold and absolutely certain, the way a man feels when he's made up his mind about something and there's no talking him out of it. He didn't cross the street. He didn't say a word to Prudence Callahan or her mother-in-law. He didn't so much as look at them twice. That was not his way, and it never had been. Jacob Reyes had spent 41 years learning that the men and women who shouted the loudest about their own righteousness were usually hiding the most rot underneath, and he had no interest in giving anyone the satisfaction of a scene. Instead, he turned and walked back toward the livery, where his horse was tied, his mind already working, already building something in the quiet architecture behind his eyes, something that would take weeks to finish and would cost him nothing but time and patience, and would cost the Callahan women everything they thought they owned. Sarah didn't see him. She was too busy pulling Emma into the back room of the store, kneeling down in front of her daughter, trying to find words that wouldn't come. She'd buried a husband. She'd buried her own pride more times than she could count these last months, taking credit at the store she used to own outright, watching her savings dwindle to nothing, while the bank sent letters with dates circled in red ink. But watching her daughter's face crumple over a dress, over something as small and as vast as cruelty aimed at a child, that was a different kind of pain, one that lodged itself somewhere, Sarah didn't have words for. "They laughed at my dress, Mama," Emma whispered, and her voice was so small, so confused, like she was asking her mother to explain a math problem that didn't add up. Why kindness cost nothing and cruelty seemed to be free too. Sarah pulled her close and said the only thing she had, which was that some people mistook cruelty for cleverness, and that her dress was made with more love in it than anything hanging in the Callahan wardrobe. But even as she said it, she felt the hollowness of the words, because comfort doesn't pay debts, and it doesn't mend the particular wound of being laughed at by grown women in front of half the town. Neither of them knew that 100 yards away, a rancher worth more than the whole of Millbrook combined was already deciding, with the same quiet certainty he used when reading weather or judging cattle, that the Callahan family's easy laughter was about to become very, very expensive. The thing about small towns is that everyone believes they know everyone else's business, and in Millbrook they were mostly right, except when it came to Jacob Reyes. Folks knew he owned the Diamond R Ranch, 30,000 acres running clear to the county line. They knew he'd never married, though plenty of mothers had tried to change that over the years. They knew he paid his hands fair wages and never haggled over a debt owed to him by a family fallen on hard times. What they didn't know, because he'd never given them reason to look closer, was the particular shape of his patience, and how a man who never raised his voice could still bring a house down around people's ears without ever touching a single brick himself. Bartholomew Callahan, Prudence's husband, ran the only bank in 3 counties. It was a small operation, but it held every mortgage, every note, every debt that mattered in Millbrook, including the note on Sarah Whitfield's store, the one her husband Thomas had taken out 2 years back to expand the storeroom, the one that was now 3 payments behind and drawing looks from Bartholomew every time Sarah walked past the bank window. Jacob Reyes had never done business with the Callahan Bank. He kept his money in the territorial capital, 2 days' ride away, a fact that had always irritated Bartholomew Callahan slightly, the way it irritates a man of small ambition to see a bigger fish swim past his net entirely uninterested. Jacob had his reasons for that arrangement, reasons that went back further than most folks knew, reasons rooted in a long-ago winter, when a different small-town banker had foreclosed on his own widowed mother's land while calling himself a Christian man the whole while. Jacob had been 12 years old that winter. He remembered every detail of it, the way some men remember battles. So, when he rode back to his ranch that afternoon, after watching Emma Whitfield's shoulders curl inward on the boardwalk, he didn't go to confront anyone. He went to his study, a plain room with a plain desk, and ledgers stacked neat as hymnals, and he began writing letters. The first letter went to a man named Elias Cobb, an attorney in the capital who'd handled land purchases for Jacob for over a decade, and who understood, without needing much explanation, the particular value of discretion. The second letter went to the Territorial Land Office, inquiring after a parcel of foreclosed property just outside Millbrook, land that connected to Jacob's own holdings in a way that made perfect, obvious sense to anyone who might ask why he wanted it. The third letter, the most important one, he wrote and rewrote 3 times before he was satisfied, and it was addressed to nobody in Millbrook at all, but to a banking commission 200 miles away, a body with a quiet authority to review the practices of small rural banks when a complaint of sufficient weight was filed against them. Because Jacob Reyes knew something about Bartholomew Callahan that most folks in Millbrook either didn't know or chose not to see, which was that the man had been quietly overcharging interest on notes held by widows and struggling families for the better part of 6 years, always just within the letter of the law but nowhere near the spirit of it. Always careful to pick people too proud or too frightened to make noise about it. Jacob had learned this 2 years back, almost by accident, when an old ranch hand of his had come to him in tears over a debt on his brother's farm that didn't square with the numbers the man himself had written down. Jacob had quietly looked into it. He'd quietly kept looking into it since. The way a man keeps a loaded rifle by the door not because he plans to use it, but because he knows someday he might need to. That day on the boardwalk had simply given him the reason. The letters went out that same evening, carried by a writer Jacob trusted, a young man named Danny, who'd worked the Diamond R since he was 15, and who never asked questions about the envelopes he carried, only nodded and wrote. And back in town, Sarah Whitfield closed up her store that night, not knowing any of this, not knowing that somewhere 100 miles distant a wheel had begun turning that would change the whole shape of her family's future. She only knew that Emma had cried herself quiet in the back bedroom and that the store's till held $11 against a debt that demanded $30 by month's end, and that the world, as it so often did lately, felt like a door closing slowly on her fingers. She banked the stove, checked the lock twice out of habit, though there was little worth stealing, and climbed the narrow stairs to the room she shared with her daughter. Emma was already asleep, or pretending to be, her small back turned toward the door, the mended dress hung carefully over the chair, where she always hung it, because even in her hurt she hadn't stopped taking care of the only good dress she owned. Sarah stood in the doorway a long moment, watching her daughter breathe, thinking about Thomas, about the store he built with his own hands. about the promise she'd made at his graveside that she would keep this family standing no matter what came. She didn't know yet that help was already moving toward her, quiet as weather building beyond the ridgeline, invisible until the moment it broke. The days that followed moved slow, the way they always did in Millbrook, once the harvest was in and the cold started creeping down from the mountains. Sarah kept the store open, 12 hours a day, selling what little she could, watching her shelves grow thinner, watching the calendar with the kind of dread that had become so familiar it almost felt like company. She didn't see Prudence Callahan again that week, which was a small mercy, though she heard through Mrs. Embaugh always at the post office that the Callahan women had been telling the story of the flour sack dress to anyone who'd stand still long enough to listen, dressing it up each time with a little more cruelty, a little more delight. Emma stopped wanting to go to the store with her mother. She stopped wanting to wear the dress at all, though it was one of only two she owned. And Sarah found herself lying awake some nights doing arithmetic that never came out right, trying to figure how she might scrape together enough for new cloth before winter set in proper. What Sarah didn't know, and wouldn't know for some time yet, was that Elias Cobb the attorney had already ridden out from the capital and quietly purchased, on Jacob Reyes's behalf, both the foreclosed parcel adjoining the Diamond R and something far more interesting, a controlling share of paper debt that the Territorial Bank Commission had, upon reviewing Bartholomew Callahan's ledgers at the request of an anonymous complainant, determined had been collected improperly. The Commission's findings were still weeks from becoming public, but Cobb had learned, through the careful channels a good attorney learns to cultivate, that Callahan's bank was about to be ordered to make restitution to every family it had overcharged, going back 3 years, with interest, and that the amount owed would very likely exceed what the small bank kept in reserve. This was not something Jacob Reyes had invented or manufactured. He hadn't planted false evidence or paid anyone to lie. He'd simply lit a match under something that had been sitting there soaked in its own corruption, waiting for anyone with the patience to look closely enough and the willingness to make noise about what they found. That was the whole of his method, and it was in its way more devastating than any public confrontation could have been, because there was no one to blame but Bartholomew Callahan himself, no villain to point to except the man's own ledgers, written in his own hand. Jacob rode into town twice that week, same as he always did, buying feed, checking on a shipment of barbed wire, nodding to folks on the boardwalk the way he always had. He passed Sarah Whitfield's store both times, and didn't go in. Not yet. Though he slowed his horse each time and looked at the window display, thin as it had become, and felt that same cold certainty settle deeper into his bones. He was not a man who acted from anger. He'd learned long ago that anger made men sloppy, made them say things they regretted, made them into the very thing they despised. What moved Jacob Reyes was something quieter and in its way more dangerous. A conviction, worn smooth over decades, that cruelty, unanswered, only bred more cruelty, and that a man with the means to answer it and the choice not to was almost as guilty as the ones doing the laughing. On his second trip into town that week, he stopped by the store after all, stepping inside with the bell above the door, announcing him softly. Sarah looked up from behind the counter, surprised. Jacob Reyes rarely came into the dry goods store himself, usually sending one of his hands for supplies. He nodded to her, polite and unhurried, and made a small purchase, coffee and a length of rope, nothing that would draw attention. But as she wrapped his goods, he glanced toward the back room where Emma sat quiet on a stool, mending something with small, careful stitches, her face still carrying the shadow of that day on the boardwalk. "Fine seamstress, your girl," Jacob said, quiet, not looking to make conversation so much as stating a simple fact. Sarah blinked, surprised by the kindness of it, small as it was. "She's had to learn young," she said, and there was no self-pity in it. Just plain truth. Jacob nodded again, paid for his goods, and left without another word. But Sarah stood there a long moment after the bell. Above the door went, still turning the exchange over in her mind, wondering at the strange, quiet weight of it, not knowing that the man who'd just left her store was at that very moment holding the paper that would soon bring down the bank, threatening to take her home out from under her. It was another 2 weeks before the truth of what Jacob Reyes had set in motion began to surface. And when it did, it came not as a scandal shouted in the street, but as a series of quiet, official letters, the kind that arrive by post and are read alone at kitchen tables, the kind that change a family's whole future without a single voice being raised. The first letter went to Bartholomew Callahan himself, informing him that the Territorial Banking Commission had completed its review and found significant, sustained irregularities in his lending practices, particularly concerning interest calculated against small notes held by widows, laborers, and families in financial distress. The letter was formal, cold, and utterly without mercy, laying out figures that Bartholomew Callahan could not dispute because they were drawn from his own handwriting. He was ordered to make restitution to 11 families in the county, Sarah Whitfield's among them, with the overcharged interest returned in full and the remaining balance on each note reduced accordingly. For Sarah, this meant the debt she'd believed stood at $30 was, in truth, less than half that, the difference having been quietly siphoned off her account for the better part of a year, without her ever having the education or the standing to question the numbers a banker showed her. The second consequence, and the one that truly brought the Callahan household to its knees, was that the Commission's findings, once official, became a matter of public record, and word of that kind travels through a small town faster than fire through dry grass. Within days, half of Bartholomew Callahan's remaining depositors had withdrawn their savings and moved them to the bank in the next county over, a bank that suddenly seemed a great deal more trustworthy by comparison. A bank cannot survive on reputation alone once that reputation curdles, and Bartholomew Callahan watched, over the course of that autumn, as the institution his father had built and he had inherited crumbled not from some grand act of sabotage, but from the simple, unglamorous weight of the truth catching up to him. Prudence Callahan, who had laughed so freely at a child's mended dress, found herself instead the subject of a very different kind of talk around town, one that followed her into church, into the general store, into every room she entered for months afterward. There is a particular kind of justice in a small town, learning exactly what kind of people it had been quietly admiring, and Millbrook was not a forgiving audience once it understood the truth. The fine bonnets and the easy laughter didn't disappear overnight, but the respect behind them did, and respect, once lost in a town like that, is nearly impossible to earn back. None of this, not one letter, not $1 of restitution, not one moment of the Callahan family's reckoning, had come with Jacob Reyes's name attached to it anywhere. Alias Cobb had structured every filing, every complaint, every purchase of debt paper, through channels that led back only to a numbered account and a discreet attorney's office 200 miles distant. Jacob had insisted on that from the very first letter he wrote. He had no interest in being thanked. He had even less interest in being known as the architect of another family's ruin, however deserved that ruin might have been. He simply wanted the thing set right, wanted the scales to tip back toward something like fairness, and he wanted to do it in a way that cost him nothing but time, patience, and the price of a few letters and an attorney's modest fee, an amount so small against his fortune it barely registered as an expense at all. Sarah received her own letter from the Banking Commission on a gray Tuesday morning, and she read it 3 times standing at her counter before she understood what it meant, before the number at the bottom of the page truly settled into her mind. Her debt cut nearly in half. The threat of foreclosure gone. She sat down hard on the stool behind the counter and put her face in her hands and wept. Not from sorrow this time, but from something so close to relief that it felt, for a moment, indistinguishable from grief. Emma came running from the back room at the sound of her mother crying, frightened, and Sarah pulled her close and laughed through her tears. An unfamiliar sound in that store these last months, and told her daughter that they were going to be all right, that the store was going to be all right, that whatever had happened, whoever had made it happen, they had been given a chance to breathe again. Water moved through Millbrook the way it always did, and within days most everyone knew that 11 families had been quietly cheated by Bartholomew Callahan's bank, and were now being made whole. What almost no one knew, and what Sarah herself would not learn for several more weeks, was the name of the person who had first raised the alarm, who had pulled the thread that unraveled the whole tapestry of Callahan's quiet corruption. She assumed, like most folks did, that it had been one of the other cheated families finally working up the courage to complain to the territorial authorities. She had no reason to think of Jacob Reyes at all, beyond a vague, warm memory of him complimenting Emma's needlework on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon. But threads, once pulled, have a way of leading back to their source no matter how carefully a man tries to hide his hand in the weave. It was Elias Cobb, in the end, who let the truth slip, though not out of carelessness. He came to Millbrook himself that November to finalize the paperwork on the land parcel Jacob had purchased adjoining the Diamond R. And in the small talk of closing the deal at the town's one respectable dining room, he mentioned to the clerk handling the transaction, almost offhand, that it was a shame Mr. Scragg Reyes hadn't gotten more credit for his work with the banking commission earlier that year. The clerk, a woman named Louisa Fenn, who ran the dining room and heard every piece of gossip that passed through Millbrook, whether she wanted to or not, filed the comment away, the way she filed everything, and mentioned it, almost as offhand herself, to Sarah Whitfield the following week, when Sarah came in to settle her family's small account there. Sarah went very still when she heard it. She asked Louisa to repeat what she'd said, and Louisa did, a little confused by the intensity of Sarah's attention, and by the time Sarah walked out of that dining room into the cold November air, she understood, with a clarity that made her chest ache all over again, exactly whose hand had been behind the letter that saved her home. She thought back to that day at the counter, Jacob Reyes complimenting Emma's stitching, his eyes lingering just a moment too long on the girl, before he left without another word. She thought about how quiet he'd always been, how he'd never once made a show of his wealth or his standing, how he'd built an empire of land and cattle across that county without ever raising his voice above a conversational murmur. And she understood all at once that a man who could have simply confronted two cruel women on a boardwalk, who could have shamed them publicly and taken his satisfaction in the spectacle of it, had instead chosen a slower, quieter, far more thorough kind of justice, one that cost him nothing of his own comfort and asked for no recognition at all. She found him 3 days later at the edge of town, near the livery, checking over a wagon load of fence posts, with the same unhurried attention he gave everything. She walked up to him without quite planning what she'd say, and when he looked up and saw her approaching, something in his expression shifted, just slightly, like a man who knows he's been found out and has already made his peace with it. "You didn't have to do it," Sarah said, and her voice shook a little, though she'd meant to sound steadier than that. Jacob set down the fence post he was holding and looked at her for a long moment before he answered. "Wasn't right what happened to your girl," he said. "Wasn't right what was happening to you either, though I expect you already knew that part." "You could have told me," Sarah said. "You could have taken some credit for it." "Didn't do it for credit," Jacob said. "Simple as that, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Did it because it needed doing, and I was in a position to do it without it costing me much of anything. Man in my position who doesn't use what he's got to set things right when he sees them gone wrong. That's a man who's wasted everything he built." Sarah stood there a moment, the cold wind moving between them, and she found herself studying his face the way she might study a puzzle she'd only just realized had a solution all along. There was nothing performative in him, nothing that asked to be admired. He'd simply seen a wrong and moved to correct it, quietly, thoroughly, at a cost to himself so small he barely registered it, and at a cost to the Callahans so total it had reshaped their whole standing in the county. "Emma asks about you," Sarah said finally, surprising herself with it. "Wants to know who the quiet man is who bought coffee and complimented her stitching." Something almost like a smile moved across Jacob Reyes's face. Then, brief as a bird crossing a window, "Tell her the stitching was fine work," he said. "Tell her a mended seam holds stronger than one that's never been tested." Something worth remembering, that. Winter came hard to Millbrook that year, but it came to a household that no longer trembled every time the mail arrived. Sarah kept the store, the debt manageable now, the shelves slowly filling again as trade picked back up. Once folks understood the Whitfield family hadn't been cheated out of their due the way Callahan's bank had cheated so many others. Emma wore the flour sack dress through that whole winter without a flicker of shame, because somewhere along the way, without anyone quite explaining it to her in so many words, she'd come to understand that the cruelty of two women in fine bonnets said everything about their own smallness and nothing at all about the worth of a mended seam sewn with a mother's careful hands. Jacob Reyes came by the store now and then through that winter, never announcing himself as anything more than a customer, buying coffee, buying rope, sometimes just standing at the counter a moment longer than the transaction required, watching Emma at her mending with something like quiet approval in his eyes. He never made a speech about kindness. He never once brought up the Callahans, or the letters, or the fortune. He'd spent almost nothing to change an entire family's fate. That wasn't his way, and by now Sarah understood that it never would be. But something had shifted between the two households all the same, something built slow and wordless the way the strongest things usually are, out of shared hardship on one side and quiet conviction on the other, out of a girl's mended dress and a rancher's decision that some wrongs, however small they might look to a passing stranger on a boardwalk, worth answering all the same. The Callahans left Millbrook the following spring. The bank sold to new ownership, their names spoken less and less as the seasons turned. Sarah Whitfield's store still stands on that same street today, and if you ask around long enough, some of the old-timers will tell you the story of the flour sack dress and the quiet rancher who never raised his voice, and how the loudest lesson that whole county ever learned came from a man who never once shouted it, because the truest justice, the kind that actually changes something, rarely needs to.